and thanks guys for joining. I actually, at least from my point of view, I think I'm quite pleasantly surprised with how many of you have joined. I'm not necessarily anybody special in any given way at all. So you're definitely a step ahead of the most, and I guess probably me at your stage by being proactive, and we can go into that later. But I didn't start attending these sort of things until my last year, and it's definitely something I would change. I think that even if you get nothing out of this today, the fact that you've got nothing out of this is something, because it means that you probably don't want to go down my path, or at least you don't want to end up doing what I'm doing. So I think that's useful for you guys no matter what. I'll give you a bit of history on my background just to give you a bit of context, and then we can go into, basically I'm going to go into what I do. I think that's the most interesting thing for you guys. You may find it super dull. You may find that you don't understand any of it. You may find that you think it's far too easy, and actually you want to get into something far more complex than I'm doing, which is totally fair enough. But regardless, I think that's probably the best way to do this. And then Azam and Carmen have just asked me to go into sort of some generic tips as to how I would advise you guys go about your paths from here. For sure, without any question, I've got very lucky over the last couple of years, but I think there's certain ways to get lucky. So I think that's quite important to at least try and give my point of view on that. Anyway, so I guess you can see on screen now, and you can probably hear in my accent, I'm initially from just outside London. I now live in London. I'm actually on my sister's balcony right now. I couldn't make it home. I've gone out. I have the week off work this week, and me and my sister, my girlfriend, have gone out for a nice day, and I've broken down in my car. So the best place I could make it back to was my sister's flat. So that's where I'm calling you from, on her balcony right now. As I say, I live in London now, from just outside. In terms of where my story really starts in getting interested in was, I went to a top UK school, was on track to graduate and go to a top UK university, I guess would be what my mates did. And then at 16, I was offered to sign what was basically a professional contract in the 3rd division of English football, which it was for me wasn't the hardest decision I've ever made. I definitely got some questions at the time. Those people definitely felt vindicated when 2 years later I was released. But it wasn't a particularly hard decision. It was what I'd always wanted to do. I chased my dream, if you want to put it in a really corny way, and went and signed that contract, which means that you have to drop out of school, which was tough. You do what I've written is called a bare bones education over that 2-year period. It's not very easy to put that into context, but what I would say is that the top last 2 years in school in the UK, you do your A-levels. I didn't do my A-levels. I did something lesser to that. The points that added up to in terms of university applications meant that the SFU administration process was particularly difficult. I'll be perfectly frank. Soccer was what got me into university. I think when I walked out of university, it was more than vindicated with my GPA. But in terms of getting into the university, it was soccer that got me in. And that was in 2013. So I basically came to the university knowing very little about it. I was admitted 4 months before I started, and I agreed to join in May. I was there by August. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into, other than I knew Canada was a very well-educated country, and that as I looked it up, it was a top university in Canada, and I wanted to go and live in Vancouver. It genuinely was that simple an equation. I'm very thankful I went to SFU. I found the experience totally something I will never forget. But it wasn't the most planned entry you'll ever see from an international student going to SFU. I graduated with a BA in economics in 2017 and a minor in business. I imagine I'd done all the courses that you guys did. I had a more than handy GPA. I had to obviously balance the course load of soccer and class, but I'm sure you guys have more than enough stuff that you have to balance. I know from experience that a lot of you guys work your way through university, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. I obviously didn't because I was playing soccer and that was my time load. If I was you and you're looking to apply to at least foreign banking industry, I would flag that massively as something you did. I think the ability to maintain a good GPA or a credible degree at what is regarded as one of the top 3 hardest schools to get an A in North America, that's a fact. I sold that when I was applying to jobs. If you're doing a job at the same time right now, good on you. Sell that hard when you go to apply for jobs. So I left in December of 2017. Basically, in terms of how I went about it, I had applied for lots of internships the summer before. I don't think it will be a surprise to a lot of you guys to hear that in London, which is probably alongside New York, the most competitive banking sector in the world, and you are competing against the rest of the world. Everyone from any country is looking to secure a banking role and a markets-facing role in London and New York. I didn't get any internships from some of the top banks. I went and took an internship on the trading floor of what is a spread betting firm, fundamentally. So they still do trade, but it doesn't work anything like a bank. It was a great markets-facing experience. It added to my CV no end. However, it wasn't what I was wanting to do. I then left school in December of 17, as I said. I did have an offer from them and a couple of others, but I kind of wanted to pursue the idea that I was going to go and work in global markets in London and kind of keep hammering that door until it burst open. And then what happened basically was, to cut a long story short, my desk, which is called balance sheet management, which is a terrible name for what we actually do, but that's the name of our desk. It split in half and it doubled. And they were looking to hire some analysts. They didn't want anyone off the grad scheme, and they went and hired externally. I obviously found the placement and put my CV and my covering letter in, and I got a call from HR, and about 4 interviews later, I ended up with a job. I will go into that later because at least from your point of view, you might think what I'm saying is a load of rubbish, as I said, but it's useful to hear other people's story. I treated that few weeks of that interview process from the first minute they called me as the hardest exam I've ever done. I think that's the only way you can go about it, in my opinion. It is an exam process. They'll tell you that you're selling yourself, and that's a fact. But as I say, we can talk about that later. I started in April of 2018, and I've been working there for 2 and a bit years now. I say working there, now working from home most of the time, until we start going back into the office full time. London's not doing quite as well as Vancouver on the old COVID R rate. So yes. Anyway, moving on. So as I said, what probably is most interesting for you guys, I think, if I was wanting to see, is just an understanding of what different people do in the industry. So my job title is an associate trader. When you would think of a trader in the most fundamental TV, movies, internet, newsworthy, whatever type you would think of, you would probably think of a couple of things. One would be potentially a hedge fund trader. Don't work for a hedge fund. Most likely would be you would work on the sell side of at a bank. Now, the sell side would mean that you are what's called market making, and you are day trading in terms of you're basically connecting end users. You're taking risk. Depending on what bank you work for, you may roll over that risk. And there's many ways to do it, but the traditional sense of what a trader does is market making. I would suggest that my role is actually more akin to what is basically a portfolio manager. BSM is the treasury desk, markets facing desk for HSBC, and the balance sheet that we run is the UK balance sheet. Now, there is a balance sheet management team for each region, and it's run out of those. We run the UK based entities balance sheet, and that makes us the buy side, which is why I would say we're more like a portfolio management desk. What we do is kind of split into two. As the treasury, there, and I don't know what your guys' understanding of what a treasury is. I know that when I walked out of university, mine was very thin. But you could have a bank treasury that fundamentally does only that only acts on behalf of the entity and is not looking to make any. And what it does is basically hedge risk and manage very, very important metrics. You can see on the screen there, that's kind of what I've called as on behalf of the entity. So we manage the cash, the liquidity, the funding, and the interest rate risk in the banking book, which is what that IRBB stands for. And we do that through a lab portfolio. In terms of what those mean, fundamentally, we manage 34 currencies on the desk on a day-to-day basis. We manage the interest rate risk, and we manage those balances in minor currencies down on a daily basis, which is a relatively straightforward process, especially on the UK bank. It's not the markets. We aren't connected to the markets team. We're our own separate, I guess, markets division. We have to manage what are quite important metrics for that the regulators set for us in terms of liquidity and funding. They're 30-day measures, they're 12-month measures. They're all very interesting things, but they're not what I think you guys have called in for or are interested in at this stage. Now, you may definitely end up working on Treasury desk, and I will emphasize until the cows come home, and I'd be told off by anybody who works with me, if not, that they are the most important things the desks do. However, what I'd imagine you guys are interested in is what we do as a profit center. In terms of that profit center, we manage that lab portfolio, and lab means liquid asset buffer. So because we're the Treasury, we need to make sure that all our assets are what are called HQLA, which are high quality liquid assets. So we need to prove at all times that they could be sold or repoed, basically monetized is the word that is used in an instant, basically in an instant, or what is regarded as a fair time frame. That means, and I'll go into that, and you can see below that we invest in mainly govies, which are government bonds, SSAs, which are super sovereign and agencies, so they're a level below govies. They're very, very popular in Europe, and what they basically are is, if I give you an example, it may be that it might be a German road builder or a German project developer which is either implicitly or explicitly guaranteed by the government. And that's not always the case for SSAs, but what they are kind of long-term projects for either sovereigns or agencies beneath that. Covered bonds, which are secured bank debt, which is secured by a portfolio of mortgages. No point going into huge detail about that. That is the book that I run on the desk at the moment. I find it super, super interesting. It's the furthest out on the credit spectrum that we reach as a desk. In terms of what the credit spectrum means, govies are the most liquid, the least credit, the sovereign risk. If you wanted to take risk against the debt that you are buying, if you bought the US Treasury's debt, that is regarded as they will never default on that debt, versus, for example, a super sovereign or a bank. So you move down the credit spectrum as it's referred to. We also trade swaps and swap derivatives. So they are basically rates-related products, which we can go into if you guys have more questions. We trade repo on the desk, and we also trade FX forwards. So we have a lot of coverage between what is fundamentally 8 or 9 of us. And that means for me, when I walked into the desk, it was super confusing, but I found it the best place you can ever learn when you come out of university, because you are exposed to such a wide variety of products and markets. Now, you could go onto a sell-side desk and concentrate on a single product. You might go onto an FX desk and learn all about FX, and that's great. And you would learn about the markets at the same time, but you are a specialist in FX. At this present time, what we are is kind of a jack of all trades. And then I guess you can see in terms of the risk we take, there's different types of risk there. There's no point going into all of them. But fundamentally, what I'm trying to present is the fact that in terms of as that profit center and optimizing that revenue, we're given a revenue target each year. We have multiple ways to express a view that can hit that revenue target. Now, equally, that can move against you. It's called risk. It's not guaranteed money. And so we need to be making good risk decisions in those different types of risk. So, for example, duration is fundamentally interest rate risk. Spread risk is the difference between your rates curve, your swap. So your swap versus your govy, for example, and the difference between that is just generally called a spread position. So we take views on spread positions. We take inflation views. So we trade outright and asset swapped linkers, as they're called, or tips, as they're called in the States. We can take cross currency view. So between two currencies, you have what's called a cross currency basis. Part of trades that we put on, positions we put on, have a cross currency element to that. So you need to be aware of the cross currency risk that you're taking, and then also basis risk, which is just the difference between two different bases. Which again, it's something that's not worth going into, but just reflects the different types of risk we need to be aware of on the desk.
So before you go on, Robert, that's a sizable amount of information you just gave us.
Yes.
So rather than saving all these questions for this particular slide at the end, because I know there was a lot of rich information here, there are going to be people who are in this audience that have different levels of experience. So some people who have, from when you started, had no idea what you're talking about, right? And then there's a derivation of students who might know almost everything you're talking about. So I'm going to start off with one question right off for myself. Did you know anything about this before you started?
Maybe 1% of what I know now.
Okay, so everyone,
1%.
Okay, so that's a good starting point for everyone. I just saw everyone, I could feel that everyone was like, okay, that makes me feel better. Okay,
let me emphasize, you guys are not, there's no way, even if, so when I was interviewing for this role, I did not know the answers I was not asked about all of this stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, you may, for example, if you went into this sort of an interview, you may be asked, talk me through some market event that is happening at the moment, what your view on it is, and what you might do as a result. Now, that might be as simple as, so I don't know to what extent you guys necessarily follow markets and rates, but I think you'll all be aware the impact of coronavirus was a huge monetary and fiscal stimulus. Now, the monetary side of that stimulus was cuts, and across the board, central banks have cut rates. Now, for example, if you're in an interview right now, it may be you may express a lower for longer view. Now, that might be something you've read somewhere and you might want to understand what that means more. But what you're fundamentally saying is, I don't think interest rates are going to pick up off what is basically a floor. Now, that depends on your view of negative interest rates. That might be a totally different topic for you to address in an interview, which I'm sure you learn about in your classes. So I remember doing negative rates and the potential downfalls of negative rates, but I mean, there's arguments for it. And the lower for longer argument in terms of where the economy has got itself into, where central banks are positioning themselves in this, the amount of stimulus and quantitative easing they're throwing at this. Those are the sort of things you might have to understand at the very broadest level. But to understand how to express that in spread risk, definitely no idea what that was. I didn't know what spread risk was for months when I was on the desk. I didn't know what inflation risk was for months. Now I know what inflation is. I don't know what inflation, like in terms of inflation risk, it takes a while to understand that these things are definitely not areas that I am an expert in any single way whatsoever. I am a total novice in everything on this slide. Fact. I've been working this job for 2 years. There's people who've been on my desk who've worked on it for 30 plus years, and they would profess to being partial expert in one or two of these areas. That's what makes this desk really interesting, is there is so many areas that we cover and have to address. Now, you lean on people when you do that. We have coverage, sales coverage, that put information in front of us to help us make decisions. We have teams, but like to the side of us, behind us, in front of us, whatever it might be, that speak to the regulator. When I'm saying these regulated metrics, they're the ones who speak to the regulators, and they have a better understanding of the forward projections and the forecasts of these different metrics. they're not all for me as an individual to A, fully understand, and B, know about. I mean, my job is to understand as much of this as possible and make the biggest contribution I can. But I totally understand your question, Azam, in the fact that me putting all of this on a slide makes it seem like I've learned all of this in 2 years or knew some of it going in. I knew nothing. You have to learn as much as you can, which is why I've said that process was an exam process when I went through those interviews. And you learn and you soak up as much as you can. Now, that depends on how good a desk you work on and how willing they are to teach and how proactive you are in learning. But for me to imagine that I don't even express all of these risk methods or products on a daily basis. I don't even do some of these on a monthly basis. These are areas that I consult people far, far, far more experienced than I am on a daily basis. However, what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of what we do as a buy-side treasury desk.
Perfect. So that being said, are there any questions right now about the generalities of this? Now, some of you want to ask specific questions. I know it about certain aspects of this because I have an interest in this as well. But any general questions right now that we can take? Just because I know this was a rich slide. If not, we can move on. Okay, go ahead, Robert. We'll move on then.
Sure. So yeah, as I've kind of gone over this in a way already, but let me kind of paint a picture of how we go about the profit center risk-taking portion of what we do. In that sense, let me keep it to maybe interest rate risk, just to keep it nice and plain. Now, as I say, there's different types of risk that we take. Interest rate risk is pretty much duration risk. What we do as a treasury, which is normal, is we centralize, and we don't do this ourselves, but the interest rate risk across the whole bank is centralized. Now, interest rate risk is created, for example, from, say, mortgages. Mortgages, and mortgages work different in Canada, so they do to the UK, but it might be that the bank, HSBC, in terms of the retail bank, writes Mrs. Jones a 5-year fixed mortgage at X%. Now that creates interest rate risk. The guys who are selling that mortgage product, their expertise is in selling mortgages. The guys who are managing that, their expertise is in managing that. They're also maybe offsetting risk from the other side of the bank. For example, it's what happens in banking, and this isn't necessarily in markets. This is actually the fundamental sort of follow through of banking itself. Is that Mrs. Jones' sister may also deposit X $1,000 into her account. Now, based on experience, which is not what we do, this is done beyond us. They may what's called behaviorize that cash. So they say, I believe that 60% of that, I don't know what number it is, I'm not involved in the behaviorization process, will stick around for 5 years, for example, because they can base off historical data that they know roughly what portion of retail deposits and then commercial surpluses as well. So the commercial bank is a big part of this. The commercial bank means basically banking for large businesses. And what that creates is basically everything the bank does is creates interest rate risk. Now, the bank then centralizes that interest rate risk and sends it all to us. Anything that we can theoretically hedge. So we take this centralized netted interest rate risk and what's called buy it in. And we buy that in at the market rate. Now that gives us a duration position. What we need to do with that is up to us. Now, what's I find very, very hard to understand when I first started, and to this day, you can get itchy fingers, is on my desk, doing nothing is doing something. Because if we do nothing, as we buy in this behaviorized risk, we're basically, the position is being given to us. Now, on a traditional asset management desk, and I can't speak for it fully because I've never worked on one, I'd imagine to have a position, you need to take a position. We can have a position without taking one. So what we then need to do is take a view. So we're given this risk, and we need to take a view on what we think of this risk. Now, as it says there, on our desk, doing something is doing nothing. but we need to have a view on it. It may be that, for example, it is sterling interest rate risk. Now, part of our job is to read a lot. Now, I'm in the office at 6:45 every morning, and most of what I do up until 7:40 will be read. There's certain things that need doing in the morning as well, but most of what I'm doing for that first hour is catching up on overnight news flow, because it affects what happens as your market opens at 8 o'clock. And it's not just the UK market trade. We trade quite a few markets. So we read, and then we'll discuss. We have morning meetings at the moment every day, but generally every other day on the desk, where everyone spins their chair around, and we discuss everything that's going on the desk, but also everyone's views. We have to listen, because obviously we're discussing those, and we need to. 10 heads generally are better than one. And then at some point we'll start to form a view. We speak to sales coverage, so we're covered by multiple of the major banks on what's called the street, which is just different banks. So banks you would have heard of, for example, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, BAML, Barclays UK Bank, in case you've not heard of that, Nomura, multiple sales coverage from different areas where it's their rates desk, but they have different areas of expertise. They have different focus, and we speak to them. They may put something in front of us as what they propose as, for example, a trade idea. They set up meetings with their economists, with their traders, whatever it might be, for us to continually form an opinion. This opinion isn't a one stop and done, because your risk is, you don't take the risk, do something about it, and then leave it. You need to know what's going on with this risk, basically at all times. Then you kind of get to your position where you're taking this view. You may look at historical data. So it may be that your view is on sterling spreads, and you're starting to see where sterling spreads have been over the last few years, for example. You may see what's the total that for example, recently in sterling spreads with what happened with COVID, you had quite a blowout in sterling spreads, and spreads got quite wide, as they're called. So large gap between the two curves. And you're starting to look at how wide can this go? Those sorts of questions. They're where you're looking at when you see it in the movies or whatever it is, when you see it online, when you have all the charts, and if you were to come and see our desk, and you've got guys, all of us, with multiple screens in front of us with different charts and different prices. That's what you're starting to do in terms of analysing that data and how it's moving. And you're trying to also, by speaking to coverage, get a picture of flows in terms of the way the market is thinking, because that's really quite important in what you do. You may have a view and it might be right, but if it's the wrong time because the market doesn't want that to be the right time, it won't go well for you. So we then, as I say, collaborate and compare. So that's kind of the morning meetings. We're constantly in discussion. Working from home at the moment is definitely difficult for us. What we do is not siloed at all. We are overlapping in the risk that we may be looking to take, the risk that we may be looking to take off. You don't want one guy who's sitting next to me have a totally opposite view and then express it as me, who takes a view and expresses it, because you're fundamentally doing for the desk net nothing, and you're paying you will pay a bid offer on both those trades, and you may end up with no risk and therefore no position. So you need to make sure that the view is not necessarily shared by the desk, but is desk led. That kind of ties in with what I said there. Depending on, and I know this is true from experience, but not that I've ever worked on them, but I've obviously spent different times on different desks. What you'll see in different desks around the world, in different jobs, is individual trading books. Now, on our desk, we don't have individual trading books. All the books are owned by the desk. Therefore, there's no argument of I'm taking this because it's my view. It needs to be not necessarily a common shared view, but it needs to be the desk's view. And then we express that view. So once we have an idea of what we might want to do with that risk, that might be taking off risk, it might be adding risk, it might be slightly tweaking risk. So, for example, we put on what are called RV trades. So you move out of one bond, for example, into another because you think the gap between the two, the value between the two has slightly changed in favour of another. And all of this we're not doing on a daily basis. We aren't a day trading desk. We're under a lot of restrictions where we have to prove we're not actually trading. We're not just trading for the sake of it. It's not prop trading. It is all risk management. And as I kind of started to allude to there, everything on the previous slide in terms of the products and the risk we can take is the where, why, and hows. Now, the how much was something that took me a long time to understand. We do, but we don't, talking millions. We, in a cash sense, it's no good, because if you take risk for, let's call it 1 million in 1 year, that's very, very different to 1 million in 10 years. Because in a risk sense, in a DVO1 sense, now that's something that you'll probably come across in your classes. And if it's an area you want to explore in terms of going into the rates market, you'll need to understand DVO1 slightly before you go in. But it's basically the move per basis point and the risk that you're taking per basis point. And we express the risk in risk terms, not in a cash notional terms. That's slightly confusing, I found, when I first started the job, but it's also super interesting and starts to get you talking in a certain way, and then it leads your thinking. There's no point really embellishing on that too much unless you've got loads of questions on it, but it's important to understand when risk in a risk sense. And then we're also subject to TART, where you need to, when you're expressing your view, especially as a junior like me, you may go to someone senior and say, I like the idea of this risk. And they'll say, okay, where do you want to enter this? And where's your stop? And what's your limit? And basically those questions are saying, the way we work, you can't just go and put on a position and just let it run forever, because as the bottom says, we have things called NII and MPB. Now, NII is your net income, and that's what you get paid on a daily basis, basically, more or less, the interest. So if you had your own bank account and it paid, I don't know, call it 0.5% in interest, how you get paid on that each time is your NII. Now, MPB is how that risk is moving, because in your bank account, you're not really taking any serious risk there. It's underwritten up to a certain amount. Whereas it may be that the value of what we bought as an asset is moving up and down, and therefore we have to understand where we bought it versus where it is now, and that's the net present value in terms of give or take. And it can be plus or minus, and we have as a desk rules and at the very top level in terms of how negative it could be before certain conversations would have to exist. Luckily, since I've been on the desk, it's the guys, and obviously I'm now part of that, do an absolutely phenomenal job at managing that, and it seems to stay positive, I guess, a lot. And when you're in the money, as it's called, you can monetize that and you take that cash up front, which is why it's called net present value. So that's kind of what we do. We either get given risk, or we look to go and take risk, and we discuss it and we analyze it, and then we put on the position, and then we're constantly looking at that position in context of the book in total. And there's certain constraints I've got on the next slide that will help understand that. But against itself, how's it getting on? Where do we want to? Have we got a moving target in terms of where we might want to take that out and things like that? So I think the easiest part to understand for me, if I was talking to me as a 3rd or 4th year econ student, the easiest part to understand, and I think that the part which I would suggest to be focused on as you move into the kind of the interview stage, or whatever stage you guys are at, is this drivers. Now, the drivers on the desk are what moves the risk we take, is pretty much the easiest way to put it. Now, I put numerous things there, and we could talk about them all day, because I guess my job, to a certain degree, and don't get me wrong, my job is definitely not doing what I'm saying is only this profit center part. We spend a lot of time making sure that the treasury function of this desk is totally under control. That is the first and foremost. We have to make sure that all the on behalf of the entity parts are met. But in terms of this other part, and even for that part too, actually, you need to constantly understand, which is why you're reading, listening, speaking to the coverage, these drivers. So the drivers are your macroeconomic environment. That's the biggest. That's your big circle, includes everything. If your friend, your uncle, whoever it might be, works in markets, and you said you had an interest in it, they might just vaguely talk to about your view on the macro environment. Now, that is, for example, what I was talking about earlier. You may have seen that central banks have cut rates, and you may hold a lower for longer. You may think that the oodles of stimulus going in here is super inflationary. You may think that the event risk on the horizon, now, for example, that is Brexit. That's kind of been and gone, but it's rearing its head again. It's COVID, which again we're in the middle of. It's US elections. It's the difference in policy, in fiscal policy between what's fundamentally going to be Trump versus Bernie Sanders. Realistically, is what that's going to be. And Bernie Sanders being kind of your liberal and your big spender, how that plays out in terms of your fiscal packages and how that displays itself in the market. Those are the sort of things that we have to be on top of every day. Now, obviously, I put monetary policy there. That's a fact. We work in a rates world. I work in a rates world. Monetary policy is everything. But it's kind of being caught up in the traditional sense by fiscal policy, because what governments are doing to react to COVID is now huge. It's absolutely huge. I won't necessarily go into my full view on self-funded sovereigns, but monetary policy is now, to some people's mind, dictated by fiscal policy, which is a very different from your textbook world that old school economists basically share. And then obviously inflation's there, kind of touched on that a little bit, and then credit. So credit, as I've kind of referred to earlier, I guess this is all looping in, is your credit spectrum and your view on credit. And it may be that as we come into more macroeconomic uncertainty, which your view might be, it might be now, it might be that it's still coming, it might be that it's a second wave problem, it may be that we're at the end of a cycle in general. So even if we get out of this, all the credit conditions start to worsen. And therefore what you see when credit conditions worsen are basically, you see price risk of default. So if you're buying debt, if the person who needs to pay back that debt in the very simplest terms might default, you'll see that debt will be worsened in the market, to put it very bluntly. The price of that debt will fall. Now, those drivers are then set off for us on our desk specifically, and they're very specific to different desks with the constraints that you have. We have, and don't get me wrong, we have to have an eye on all of these at all times, but we can't manage these on a minute-to-minute basis. Over 2,000 different limits that we have to adhere to on the desk. Now, when I talk about limits, you're talking about market risk limits, you're talking about credit risk limits, you're talking about inflation, like different limits where people at a higher level to us, but sometimes what's called a second line of defense level as well. They basically set out a risk appetite for you to then go and use your expertise to express the views we talked about before and the risks we talked about before. Now, on top of those limits, you have regulations, which you talked about, kind of touched on briefly. You've got the LCR and NSFR. Those are liquidity and funding metrics that we need to manage as a desk. That is our responsibility as balance sheet management, to make sure that they're well protected at all times. And if not, the regulator would come knocking very, very quickly. Volcker is basically off the back of 2000, like in 10, 15 years ago, you tried to remove prop trading, so we don't, when I refer to my job title as a trader, we're more of a risk manager, portfolio manager. We're not allowed to go and take positions and trade in and out of them in the day and try to be funky with it. Don't get me wrong, there are market makers whose job it is to do that. However, for us, that's not the way we work, and we have to adhere to quite strict Volcker rules, which is Paul Volcker, is a former Fed chair. And then we have what are called risk-weighted assets. It's just another example. So everything we buy, as I'm talking about, as I've kind of referred to, those assets, they are risk-weighted in terms of for example, probability of default. Now, it's more to it than that, but if you were just to put it at that very simple level, the more likely the bank views them to default, the more risk weighting they put on it. Therefore, it costs us more capital as a desk to be able to invest in those. Now, we have to weigh up those decisions as we're given a certain amount of risk-weighted assets to use, because they need to be used basically efficiently amongst the bank. The bank doesn't have an infinite amount of capital. When you look at a balance sheet, the capital will be a portion of it, and the bank needs to choose where that goes. So that's kind of a really, really rough overview of what we do. However, I totally understand that covers so much stuff. You're also hearing it from somebody who's only been in the job 2 years. Now, I'm very lucky that I've learned a lot in those 2 years, but I'm nowhere near an expert in anything on any of these slides. I would not profess to be an expert in any of these stuff. I wouldn't even be close to being an expert on any of these. Even these drivers, which I say I read about every day and basically somewhat consume your life, and you're constantly, I'm on holiday at the moment for this week, but I'll be checking my phone to see what's going on in markets. I'm nowhere near anywhere close to an expert on any of these. I'm a novice. But for the sake of trying to help you guys understand what different people do in the market, I try to give you as round a picture as possible, just because it might be one or two things that pique your interest. And you may say, oh, that sounds interesting. How do I learn more about that? So that's kind of it in that sense. What I have after this, which is what Azam and Carmen asked me to do, is basically some advice. But I guess we can, if it suits you, ask any questions in terms of the role and what I do on a daily basis. Now, if that's probably, and then we can split this in two.
Yeah, I think we should do that, just because there's a lot of rich information there. However, I don't want to miss out on so the advice part, because I think that's actually quite crucial. And I'm also aware of time.
Yeah, sorry, I probably went on a little bit longer.
No,
I could talk about this all day.
I was totally engaged, to be honest. So, so why don't we take a few questions here, because I think it's pretty critical that we go over what to do, so we can go from a general. So if there's any specific questions right now in terms of generalities of what Robert does, we'll take more at the end. But is there anything that's that people want to ask right now? We'll take a couple.
And look, don't get me wrong, guys. If I know the position you're in, and if you want to reach out to me,
go ahead, Jamal.
Ask separately. That's fine.
Jamal, you have a question? So we'll have Jamal Dumas, Mike. Okay. He says, I was interested in sort of what was working in finance like, especially in terms of the day to day. So, and that's a good question. You start at 6:45. What time do you end?
So I start in the morning at 6:45. I finish on a normal day around probably 5:45. That's what my day looks like. The idea of everybody living outrageous lives and throwing people against walls and lots of things like that definitely doesn't exist on my desk. I cannot talk for everybody's desk, but I'm pretty sure the industry has changed a lot since basically the movies have depicted it in a certain way and the media have depicted it in a certain way. What's the culture like? For me, everything I've found is everything that I'd want in a grad role. The culture is super learner friendly. It encourages development. We have a very mixed desk. Now, as I've kind of said, London is a central hub for finance, basically. So if I paint a picture for you, so my boss is from America. My manager is from Australia. I work next to a Filipino girl and a French guy. We have an Indian guy who I also work next to. We used to have a Singaporean guy who's just left, a South African girl who's just moved on. On the other side of the desk, so the equivalent side, you've got another Indian guy, a girl from Turkey, just to paint the picture in terms of you have the whole world, A, wanting to work there, but B, sharing, like the value of their knowledge and history and expertise adds value to the desk, and people are well aware of that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the only English guy on the desk. There's 2 other English guys on the desk. However, it's not the brazen culture that it's painted to be. And I'm sure there are desks like that. We don't work on the sell side. Sell side can theoretically be slightly more competitive. But again, I've got lots of friends in the industry, and they don't see it like that anymore. It's still super competitive in terms of driving yourself and the team, but you don't have the sort of things you see in the movies.
We'll take one more question from Dustin. Dustin, I'll unmute your mic. Go ahead.
Hey, I just have a question about once you got into the role, the sorts of tools or skills that you actually end up using in the first couple years. So you mentioned at the beginning, people might not follow all the terms you're using, etc. I'm probably the opposite of the representative student here, where like I understood pretty much all the terms, but then my math skills and like the core courses, for example, are not going to be as competitive as other students. So I'm just kind of wondering if you can speak to the sort of hard skills that you use in the first couple of years.
So I think that's a really good question. So
I'm going to unmute your mic. Mute you.
I think that what you'll find is that, and my advice is, and you'll see it in the next slide, is that if that's what you have to offer and sell, then you need to offer and sell that, because not everybody on the desk does the same thing. Not everybody on the desk has the same skill set. It's purposely created so that people on the desk, because no one really works on their own in markets really, have a complementary skill set. Now, in terms of the hard skills, your old school keyword is being analytical. Now, everything we do is analytical. That's a fact. Being an analytical person really is not going to get you that far, because I mean, it's just your base parameter. Mathematically, yeah, don't get me wrong, you have to be pretty sharp mathematically, but actually once you start to get au fait with the sort of maths you're doing, it's not, I mean, you're not doing calculus. I mean, there's certain desks you are, I mean, if you want to be a quant, whatever it might be, there is certain things where mathematically it can become super, super complicated. But once you start to become comfortable with the general math direction that you're headed at as a desk, it's not, I mean, I was good at maths, but not an exceptional mathematician in any way at all. Then in terms of the other skills, and I can go on to this, but for me, what this moving towards is your skill, your IT skills. So whether that be that you're a genius in BBA, it may be that you've learned to code Python, whatever it is. And if you've not done any of those things, it doesn't mean that you won't get these roles, because I hadn't done this at the time, but that's the skills people are looking for now. If you can add analytical value more than just, oh, I thought this and therefore said this. Well, if someone can do that, but then also create something that then analyzes that for you on a minute by minute basis, that adds a lot more value to the desk. So the hard skills, you need to be able to speak to people, I guess, is a soft skill as well. You speak to people quite a lot. Now, again, that's to a varying degree. That's as much as you want to do it, but you will speak to people. But the hard skills, I'd say, are moving towards as in line with your analytical skills, basically your IT analytical skills.
So Robert, I'm going to get you to move on to the next slide. Chris, can you just save your questions to the end, because we'll just hold on to them if you don't mind. Can we get to that next slide, Robert? Go ahead. Yeah, sure. So this is what Adam asked me to do, and I kind of approached it as if I had my time again in your position. And I don't even mean this in a sort of look down way. I can totally I remember is 2 years ago for me. I know nothing compared to what the majority know. Like, I'm closer to you guys than I am to most of the guys on the desk. I'm a novice in this stuff. What I would have done to get to my position, because I feel lucky that I got there, is basically the following things. Fill your CV with whatever you can. Now, it doesn't necessarily, I'm not talking about
anything at all, but I've seen some CVs since I've been on the desk that were going for basically a role, my old role, if you will. They blew mine out of the water. They were unbelievable. The CVs that come onto to markets desks are great. Now, I'm not saying that if your CV is kind of a little bit gappy at the moment, that's not that hard to fill the gaps. You're filling it with things like RBC Insight Day was one I did at SFU. Now, things like that, they go on your CV. They're useful. Don't get me wrong, they might not be totally relevant to exactly the role you're applying for, but it's something to be asked about, it's something to talk about. Things like that, when I said I didn't get any internships in that first summer, I went and found an internship at that spread betting firm on the trading floor. Now, again, that's a trading role. I didn't do any trading, wasn't allowed, I'm an intern. But it's something to talk about and experience. I realized at that time that I was kind of still lacking a little bit. So I found a way to get through a contact. And at this point, to fill out your CV, lean on your contacts. It may be, I think in my opinion, it's very difficult to lean on contacts to find work these days, but to find experience and internships at smaller places. The big places won't let you in based on who you know, that's a fact. But at smaller places, to fill your CV, you will be able to use these people. And I got a 2-day experience, basically shadowing someone on it was actually a top Canadian bank stir desk. And he said, look, I can bring you in for a couple of days. That's all I'm allowed to do. I can't do any more. I said, that's absolutely fine. And then on my CV, I'm putting that as short experience on the stir desk at X Bank, because they're things that you can talk about and use. All it shows is that you have proactively sought out the position to be able to maximize your interview capacity at that point. No one is suggesting you've learnt the world in those X amount of days. It might be 6 weeks internship, whatever it is, but you've been proactive enough to show the right sort of drive for what they're after. That's key. Then, as I kind of touched on, so I won't really get into it, I am doing this myself now on the job. If you can do it in uni, do it now. Get literate in programming language. Do it. People said that to me when I was at uni, and I went, yeah, I'm not really that sort of person. I'm just going to be more of the talky person. It doesn't exist. If you can't use these programs, you're not going very far. You need to get literate in these programs. As I was going through the interview process, I was doing Excel courses. That is super basic. That's like the simplest level. Excel's being moved on in the world. It still gets used a lot, but you're looking at Python and things like that. If you can get literate in those, and I'm not talking about being an expert, but if you've done a week's course and you understand how they work and operate, you're ahead of the curve. And they're the sort of things they're after, because somebody's probably built something on the desk, and therefore if you know how to use it, great. You don't necessarily have to be the one building it. I've kind of already touched on that. Use the facilities SFU have to offer. You've already, you're listening to me, and I'm not even anywhere near the top end of what SFU has to offer. I'm just somebody who can help you because I was you recently. I've not gone and conquered the world in any which way whatsoever. However, there's plenty of people who have attended SFU, do these sort of things, who have gone super far, and hopefully you guys and maybe myself will go there one day and be able to do this again. But you need to be able to do that. Use everything they give you. It doesn't matter if it was a waste of time at the time. It will help. I'm adamant of that. If I had my time again, I would have attended way more of these things. And if your mates say they're not cool, stuff your mates. Quite frankly, your mates will, when you come up against your mate in an interview process, they'll know who's cool. Fact. Explore all the avenues. So for me, that was a case of where I explained at the very start, sort of pushing for how I ended up with this role. It was making sure that every which way you can find a way to get your CV in front of people. Now, I think mine was I'm talking LinkedIn, I'm talking websites, I'm talking about I spent the summer I tried to get internships. I spent hours and hours, evenings applying for internships. I went directly on every bank's website and tried to apply to their internships. I got nothing, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't helpful in the process of experience and working out how you get to where you want to go. Then, as I kind of said at the start, interviews are exams. If you are not prepping for that interview, it's the biggest thing that it's a door. These doors don't open that often. It doesn't matter what you think of it, whether you think the role was great or not. Do your homework. Do your homework way more than you've ever done for any interview, any exam at school. They are more important. They are your life. Your GPA at some point in your life will be forgotten. Your career, I mean, it doesn't have to be everything, but for a lot of you guys, on the basis that you've tuned into this, is huge. Your interviews are your entrance to your career. It's massive. Spend as many hours, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to paint a picture of it being this super scary thing. Hopefully most interviews will be really nice. But the more that you can give them, the better you are. I'm talking, like, as just an example, like if I reflect my own example onto to you guys, my desk is called balance sheet management. Now, as far as I was concerned, that meant we had to know everything about the balance sheet. I spent a couple of days studying HSBC's balance sheet. It turned out to be a total waste of time for the most part. However, I put in a couple of nuggets about funding ratios, things I didn't even fully understand, into my interview, and they were like, wow, you've done your homework. And they're the sort of things where they're looking for signals, not necessarily exactly what you know. That they will want you to be super smart, super on it, and they will want you to know some stuff depending on where you're trying to apply to. However, they're looking for signals. That's it. Even the university you went to is a signal. You got in there. The GPA you got is a signal. Everything is a signal. And then when you get there, I spent a few interviews wasting my time telling them the things I didn't have and why it was okay I didn't have them. Total waste of time. You got to that stage already. Tell them what you have and sell what you have. That's it. Forget what you don't have. They can work that out themselves. And if you haven't got what they're after, you're not going to make up for it by telling them, but I will do it anyway. They're looking for somebody with that skill set. So you need to sell what you do have as if it was a pitch. And don't get me wrong, don't go into an interview super salesy. I don't imagine that ever works. I never did. I'm not sure it is the best technique. But you need to tell them very quickly what you can offer, not what you can't offer.
Robert, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that I feel like I need to. So let's get some specific programming languages mentioned. You mentioned Python. Is there anything else?
So I guess anything that you can. I don't think it's necessary to mention. So I say Python because that's what we use on desk. I am in no way Python literate yet. I'm decent at VBA on Excel to the extent of what we use on the desk. I find myself lucky that I got into this role without having those abilities, and they were happy to teach me. One of my objectives this year, like actual objectives, is to start getting Python literate, because we use it, and doesn't mean I have to write all the code as of next year. But if you can fix little bugs and understand what's going wrong and understand the input to the output, that's huge.
So from what I remember, you had mentioned to me a couple of things, which I think is important. You touched on this before as well. One is you had your first round of interviews and you realized, and I don't know if this was HSBC, you realized that you didn't know your macros, or you need to learn pivot tables. Can you speak specifically to that?
Yeah, so I went into my first HSBC interview and they basically said, what you like on Excel? And I was like, I thought I was pretty good, like as in just using Excel. I was like, yeah, I'm pretty handy. They were like, so can you write macros? And I was like, no, but I can learn. I'll learn. And I was like, oh no, that's obviously something they're looking for. They liked me enough to give me a second interview, but in that week in between, I went and did a macros course in Excel, because if nothing else, it shows that I cared enough, but equally it showed that I actually am willing and able to learn that sort of thing. I thought I had the ability to learn it, and therefore I went and learned it. Again, for me, that was more signaling, but it gives you an example that they cared enough to ask that question, what are you like in Excel? And me saying, oh, I can drag down formulas, that's not even like close to cutting the mustard. You're going to be doing more using actually the nuts and bolts of Excel, what it's built for.
Let's speak about your econ experience specifically and how that was relative to other students who had gone to other universities. I'm sure others have gone to universities that were very well known. Question one, was your econ acumen the same as other students? Like, were you behind? Were you? So
I guess the answer is no, but also the answer is also it doesn't matter, and I didn't care. They're not just looking for econ grads anyway. So You've got a head start by doing your economics degree. you've gone to what is one of the hardest schools to get an A in North America. I would tell people that. I did. I don't really, if your GPA is at a B GPA, for example, and not necessarily, like mine wasn't, but just if it is, you need to actually explain, and you need to make it clear that Johnny down the road got A's because they hand out A's. And if you don't feel like your A's have been handed out to you and you've worked hard for them, and if you know deep down that you're smart and that's your GPA, and you're like, my mate is doing X at X university, and you know what, while I was at school I was banging in line with him, and he's doing this now, or he's applying to this, do the same thing. SFU's a young university, but it's a good university. You need to sell it as a good university. That would be my view. And also they're hiring geography grads, they're hiring history grads, they're looking for analytical skills. They don't just need econ grads. They'll teach you what you need to know on the econ side anyway. It will give you a head start, if anything. You're not, I can't ever envisage a picture where as an undergrad from any university, good university, you're behind the curve.
Did you provide any proof of SFU being one of the hardest universities in your portfolio? Did you do anything like this? Or was it just a talking point?
Just a talking point. I can't remember. Maybe I might have jotted it down against my GPA on my CV. Okay. But it depends how much space you want on your CV to talk about whatever it is. I try to keep mine to one page. But yeah, if it maybe you got that GPA, what does that mean? That might not be the question in Canada, but in London, that is literally the question. What does that GPA mean? Right. It was an English guy and an Indian guy interviewing me, and they wanted to get the context of that, and I added that into that context.
Perfect. Specifically, you talk about filling your CV. So again, we're gonna I know just by I know a number of these students, just by looking at them, there's a sort of, again, a spectrum of experience here. Some students who have none, okay, yeah, in finance, and others who are getting some very good experience as we speak. How do we fill this for students? One, now in this COVID time, and two, just generally.
So again, I guess it goes back to what you have and what you sell, what you have. If you're lacking direct finance experience, take it from wherever you can. Apply to as many people as you can. Reach out to people. Don't be afraid to basically embarrass yourself asking for, I'd love to come in and see what you do. That may be they may go in for a coffee with you. And if they go for a coffee with you, you may say, please, can I heard your name XYZ and you went to the same university as me, or whatever it was. I'd love to meet up for a coffee to learn about what you do. It may be that 30 minutes later, they go, look, I can probably get you in for 48 hours. I couldn't do that on my desk, for example, because of the amount of paperwork that they have to go through. But they may be in roles that exists. If they do that and they give you 48 hours, that 48 hours, bang, straight on your CV. Huge. And that's come from just reaching out to someone on LinkedIn, whatever it might be. They're the sort of things where basically I reached out to people that I didn't know, that somebody gave me the name of, that was my mum's friend's friend or whatever it was, and said, you're doing what I think I want to do. Can I call you and talk about it? Here's who I am in relation to you. Can I call you and talk about it? And at the end of the conversation, if they, and I'm pretty sure maybe in the last hour, or the fact that I babbled on, you could probably pick up my relative passion. If they can see that you're passionate and think you're quite smart, they will be willing to help. People like helping. Fact. If they're not willing to help, they're not the sort of person you're after anyway, in order to get that help. And then you're adding as many things as you can. If you've attended every one of these alumni series and you found them a waste of time, but your CV's lacking a bit, it doesn't matter, chuck them in, attended alumni series. And if someone asks you what that is, then you can talk about it. It may be that you're lacking direct financial experience. Therefore, go and learn coding language and make it a big thing on your CV. If that's your best thing, put the coding language on your CV. You don't need direct finance experience, but it's very helpful. And it doesn't need to be the traditional 10-week internship in New York or London. That's not what I had. It won't be the be all and end all factor for you in terms of where you end up. It helps though, so try it as much as you can.
Robert, I remember you sitting down with me before you left, maybe to go home, or you're on a break. I might have refer? I don't know. Think we had anybody in London, but did
No,
you?
it was. I reached out to. I think you gave me about 5 or 6 names. I reached out to all of them. Spoke to a couple of them. Found out that actually what a couple of them were doing was not relevant to what I wanted to do, but kind of spoke to me about it. I don't necessarily, and it may, and I still think it's a good exercise to do, because you may reach out and find someone who. But I think it just gives an example of being proactive. If you're proactive and you bang on enough doors, doors will open. Eventually, doors will open.
So speak to reaching out. How did you do that? And that was more of my question.
Yeah, just on LinkedIn. I just went and found these people on. You gave me a few names.
Yeah. So specifically, what did you write on LinkedIn? How did you message the people?
I just said, look, I'm graduating from SFU. I know you went there. You're now working in London. I'm from London. I'm coming home. I'm looking for, I guess, grad roles. Now, I didn't go begging and say, can you give me a grad role? It was, I want to learn more about what you do, or do you have time to talk me through the landscape of the industry, whatever it might be. And these people may be too busy, or they maybe want to help, but they forget, whatever it is. And it takes, and you get, it's not rejection necessarily, but it's a bit of a punch in the teeth when you've spent 15 minutes to an hour writing out a nice message so that you feel they're going to reply, and they read it and they don't reply. But as long as 1 or 2 do, you start to paint your picture and you start to work out what it is that you want to do, or you start to lead yourself down avenues. It's never really a waste of time. It will always come back to be beneficial to you at some point, I believe.
Speak to LinkedIn, Robert, just quickly.
What specifically? Just
generally as a tool.
So I don't use it in work, but in terms of the point at which you're in is at your career, I think it's huge. People will look in at the first step in major businesses, major firms, major banks, whatever it is a HR step. You don't even, people on who you're going to end up working for don't even look at your CVs in the first step. HR do. HR will look at your LinkedIn. Pretty much that simple as fact. Yeah. You need to make sure it looks good. It's your online CV. It's another version of your CV. I would make it, I would explain things on there as well. I try to make it as detailed as possible. I've since probably gone and deleted a lot of the detail I have on mine. So if you looked at mine, it's quite bare. Now, that's because no one really cares the details of what a student volunteer did at XYZ, because at that point you're pitching yourself. Now, I'm not really pitching myself to someone on LinkedIn. It would be, I don't use it in my day-to-day role, and therefore it's just a tracker of where you are in your career. But at your stage, at the selling stage, you need to use it as a selling tool. Can we,
is it safe to say that we can invite our attendees here to connect with you?
Yeah. Of course. And as I said earlier, if you guys don't want to ask a question now, or you think of a question, or I don't know, that it turns out that in a couple of months from now, an opportunity in what you think sounds similar to what I do opens up, and you want to talk about it, I will do my very best to come back and speak to each and every one of you, because in my opinion, if you've been proactive enough to reach out, then you deserve somebody's time. My time is worth nothing compared to some big shots' time. So I think I can spare 5 minutes for people that were in my situation 2.5 years ago.
Excellent. Now, I think we're going to open it up to questions. Carmen, do we have
Yeah, yes. There's a question from Christopher, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris. And then we can... Could you talk more about how you went about your interview prep? I know there's a lot of... structured interview prep for investment banking and capital markets roles, but how and where did you go for treasury-related interview prep? Moreover, forgive me if you've covered this, I missed the beginning a bit. How did you know you wanted to go into the treasury and balance sheet side versus more popular high finance roles like, this is a good question, IBER and S&T? So I definitely didn't know that I wanted to go into that. I fell into it. I applied for those standard IB roles. I didn't know really what you think you know what you're applying to. If you're super on it, you might do. I didn't know exactly what I was getting myself into. In terms of prepping exactly for the interviews, if you know you're going into a markets facing role, be ready to talk about markets, because they will want to talk. They're going to talk about you. But if you want to talk about markets, you're showing, again, proactivity, willing, and interest, a passion to engage in what they're doing every day. So
even if you make a point that doesn't really make sense, that's okay, unless you make it in a terribly arrogant way, and they might shoot you down, or they might just be in a bad mood. But as long as you make it in a, I've seen this going on, and basically I'm aware way, I think that's a good way of doing it. My interview, if you read up about standard IB interviews in terms of they may put you in a room and ask you random scenarios about how many tennis balls you fit in an aeroplane. None of that happened on my interview. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure it does. Never happened on any of my interview prep. I was ready for it. I guess my point is I was really ready for anything. I've never prepared for anything as hard as that ever. And I think that's true of any interview you go into where you're going to really want it. But it's difficult to answer those questions because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to go into. I applied to a wide spectrum. Speak to people. If you found what I've talked about interesting, but you talk to somebody about maybe more specifically about the FX market, and I guess my focus is more on the rates market, or you spoke to somebody about equity market. I don't even touch on it. We don't do anything to do with equities. So I haven't touched on equities at all. If you're super interested in equities, and when you go and read Bloomberg News, you always go and click on the equity section, then go and apply to it. Like, you won't know exactly what you're getting yourself into anyway. So it's kind of a directional led process. Even when if you get on a grad scheme, they're going to rotate you through desks regardless, because they know that you don't know exactly what you're getting yourself into, and they don't know exactly where your expertise are going to lie eventually anyway. These desks are quite different, but the same fundamental skills exist, which is why they'll bring in a grad class regardless. You might be like me that you don't go through a grad class, in which case I can't really say much more other than prep as like balance sheet management, for example. I thought that was going to be balance sheet led. Now, don't get me wrong, there was some stuff that was balance sheet led, and I actually went back through all my course notes and found anything I could do with balance sheet related stuff to be able to talk about gap scenarios and things like that. And it was relatively useful because it showed that I had some interest and I had some experience. But actually what I probably, if I filmed the interview and my interview prep for what I do day to day now, it's probably miles off. You just need to be able to present your, and there may be places, this is only my experience, there may be places that are totally looking for a certain thing, and therefore you need to prep that way. But my personal experience and view is that just cover all your bases as best you can. You don't know exactly what they're after necessarily anyway. A lot of job descriptions that they get put on are quite generalized. So I think it's, sorry if I haven't really answered your question, but I think it's quite a difficult question to answer.
Would you recommend applying to jobs that have 1 to 2 years experience? Is that a signal saying that's for new grads, or?
I don't know. I don't really know, actually. I'd imagine I'd have to think back, but I imagine I probably did, because as I kind of said, I kind of went about it with the leave no stone unturned attitude. I imagine it's harder to get those interviews if you're only a grad than if you're not. They exist. 1 to 2 years experience means they're probably looking for what's the equivalent of associate. Now that's called a different thing in every bank. It's like an associate vice president in certain bank, whatever. But it means that you've done your equivalent of 2-year apprenticeship rotation, whatever you call it, at a different place. If you're tight on time, I think I would concentrate on the grad roles. That's what you are. You're a grad. Concentrate on the grad roles and sell why you're the best grad possible for those roles.
Perfect. Robert, can we just quickly go over this slide, and then we'll open it up to questions again?
Sure. So I probably touched on nearly all of this at different times based on questions. So I won't go through the first couple of points. In terms of quant, they are like, finance is definitely looking for quants. If you're not a quant, don't worry. You don't have to be one. If you are one, great. You're going into a separate pool of people where they're looking specifically for quants. Make sure that you sell that. That's something I struggle to even really, like, I can't even talk to. I don't have the experience to be able to talk to it. So congratulations if you're already on that course. I guess if my biggest takeaway here would probably be this point here, in terms of it was already tough and COVID has made it tougher. You are in, and I don't mean to scare you, a very difficult position in terms of a hiring class. Hiring pace has slowed. That's a fact. That's due to tightening conditions, and also it's difficult to hire people when you can't see them. Now you're in Vancouver and you may be in a very privileged position that actually they will start hiring again because the world's opening up as normal. That's not true for London. If no one, but the point below that is if no one is hiring, that's not true. But if there's less jobs on offer at the moment, what are you doing in the meantime? Now, Azam asked me, does that mean do a master's degree? Might be. That's definitely not a bad thing to do. Does it mean using your time to learn a programming language? It might be. Does it mean that you can go and get some form of internship with or experience with anyone you might know that may be able to offer it remotely? Whatever it is, what are you doing between now and the time that you're able to access a re-energized market? Because the labor market is a market, and you are the supply, and demand is for your type of supply definitely dwindled over the last few months. That's just tough luck, unfortunately.
You're specifically talking about finance though, right?
Specifically talking about finance, yeah. It doesn't mean that you won't secure anything. I can't talk for everybody, but the generic feeling is that it's a tough hiring environment. So if you are in a tough hiring environment, how are you going to A, stick out, and B, when the environment becomes a little bit less tough, what have you got on your CV to say, here's what I did with my time in that time, to present yourself, I guess, in the best way possible. Yeah, and then again, the bottom stuff is stuff we've gone over really. Sorry, is that question?
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, just views on the market. I mean, these are things that I'm happy to talk about. I mean, we're probably short on time to be able to talk about these things, and I've really talked about them anyway. They're not necessarily my views, but the certain things that lead the market right now are factors like QE. Learn about QE. Even if you learn it to a simple degree and you learn it in your classes, go and learn more about what QE is. It's huge. It drives markets at the moment. Learn about inflation or deflation from COVID. There's plenty of podcasts or articles out right now arguing, and they're really arguing whether COVID is going to be inflationary or deflationary. Have a view. Who cares whether your view's right? Have a thought about whether you think COVID will be inflationary or deflationary. It'll probably help you in exams, if anything. And then finally, like, rates are at super low levels. There is a view out there that we're going to be lower for longer. Japanification, whatever you want to call it. Start looking up these terms and just familiarize yourself with them. If you find them interesting, the rates market and markets in general, global markets, might be down.
Okay, so let's open it up for questions, and we'll unmic people as we go along. Yeah, let's open. Does anyone have questions here? Yeah. I know we're going a little long.
People can unmute themselves if they have a question.
Okay, yeah, Go ahead. I mean, I have plenty of questions. Just quickly, Robert, what sites are you when you're getting into work at 6:45 in the morning? What sites are you going to get your information? Are they exclusive HSBC sites?
No, so well, yeah, a lot of it will be research that we're given as cover, like our sales coverage. So as clients of large banks, it will be a lot of internal bank research from not just HSBC but other banks. But our main terminal, if you looked at a trading floor, type in on the internet, you'll see screens, and it will be Bloomberg. It's your big Bloomberg terminal. Right. Now, a lot of those and don't get me wrong, some of those articles are probably only available on the terminal, and that terminal costs, I don't know, £3,000 a month. You don't go paying for a Bloomberg. However, Bloomberg is a great source. Bloomberg is a finance central hub. Go and read articles on Bloomberg. Go and read the main headlines. It will be even on the normal website, you're going to get a daily market wrap. It will just tell you what's gone on today. It may be that you don't understand any of it, and you just start to look up different words that are there. It may be that you start reading articles that are like this about whether the environment is starting to look inflationary or deflationary based on your view on stimulus from COVID, whatever it might be. Start to, if I was you, read those things only if you enjoy them. If you don't find them interesting at all, I don't think this would, like, my path would be one for you, because that's kind of what you spend your time discussing, reading, learning. But yeah, Bloomberg's a good. CNBC.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah,
I'm
you
just
can unmic yourself. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if when you guys do your research, how much you, if at all, pay attention to other people from other firms. So like I recently started following a couple of fixed income analysts from Credit Suisse, and they put out this publication called Global Money Notes every so often. So it sounds like you're familiar with this. I'm wondering like how horizontal, I guess, you go.
So I pay as much attention to other banks, economists and analysts as I do to our own. We use loads of our own internal research, but sales coverage is there to provide this sort of thing for us, which means that, to be honest, the better the sales coverage, the more likely we are to read their economists or their traders' pieces. There's loads out there that I cannot express how much there is out there. Now, there's probably a lot of rubbish out there as well, and that's quite difficult. But yeah, we for example, Credit Suisse is a good one. That they have a very, very good kind of rate/macro writer who's rough, very controversial. Will never be shy of sharing his I guess quite a binary view, which is an economist's job. That's how you get famous. If you call it right when it's a tough call, you're more likely to go well. That you have to realize where this writing is coming from. Whereas sales coverage or trader may be slightly more apprehensive in sharing a really strong view. But yeah, all sorts of banks. We get covered by the majority of the street. So we're talking nearly every major bank you could think of. We have access to their research.
Robert.
Yeah. Oh, you're on mute.
Here we go. Oh, I mean, still on mute. Okay, here we are. Do you have time to stay on for a bit longer?
I have I've got a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I need to eat my dinner at some point, but that's
okay.
fine.
So we'll stay on for a few more minutes. For those who have to leave, I want to thank Robert for joining us today. I mean, this is super interesting. I mean, I got a lot out of this, and so I really appreciate your time, Robert. But for those of you who can stay for a few extra minutes, we will be able to answer a few more questions. So we'll do that. For those of you who have to go, I suggest that you definitely add Robert in LinkedIn. You have to join SFU Economics LinkedIn. I would ask Robert that you don't accept anyone who's not on SFU Economics LinkedIn, and that's how they're going to connect to you anyways. But please do so. This was fantastic. So again, for those who have to leave and have to go, thanks for coming. And Robert will spend a few more minutes. So let's keep going with questions.
Thanks for joining, guys. My abiding message is you're listening to somebody who doesn't even know fully, like, has 2 years experience, so you're far ahead of the curve in terms of being proactive and trying to soak in as much information as possible, for sure. As I kind of alluded to, I'm not anybody special in any way whatsoever. So if you're listening to me, you're definitely going to listen to everyone.
Thanks, Robert. Go ahead. Anyone else? I have a quick couple of questions, then we can wrap it up. Then, Robert,
Sure.
in terms of your role right now, are you pulling any triggers on trades right now yourself, or is it your senior? That's
No. So I have a trading mandate. I trade. I say trade. Our role is we are traders in terms of title. It's more portfolio risk management. The word trade suggests we're in and out in a day. We're not. We take a month. We're medium-term traders taking positions for months/years. But yeah, I trade.
How this is a bit of an uncomfortable question. I'm not going to ask you for your specific salary, but I'm going to ask you whether you're on commission or salary based at this point.
So we get paid base salary, and then you get paid a bonus, and that bonus can be down to zero. It's totally firm dependent, and it trickles down from the very top level through your basically your funnel in terms of your reporting line, all the way down to a desk level, and then your boss will split that out amongst the desk if there is any to go. It's not commission based in any way. They're very keen to relay the fact that it's your ratings in terms of behavior. Don't get me wrong, those who perform best, I'm sure will have a good argument to go and knock on the door and say, I've performed, but you have to make sure that everything else in terms of conduct and contribution is in line. In terms of, I obviously would definitely not share my salary, but I know if any of you can find it online, but the entry level London grad salary is pretty publishable. So you could, that's not my salary in any way, but in terms of what you would want to know what you're going to earn as a grad, pretty standard.
Right. We had a very good question from Chris regarding the CFA.
Yes,
yeah.
I knew this would come up.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So my boss is American. He loves the CFA. He has his full CFA, and he would tell anybody to do it. I work in London, where, to be quite frank, the CFA is kind of second rate. Like, nobody cares too much, and therefore I don't have any of my CFA, and didn't affect me during the interview process. For those of you who are applying in North America does love the CFA, and therefore I would consider it if I was you. It's horses for courses. If I thought that London cared a lot for the CFA, I would have gone down that route. It's not as well regarded necessarily in the UK. However, it kind of points to what I've said earlier around, if, for example, you aren't picking up a role this year and you spend that year doing your CFA and you do well at it and you add a couple of other strings to your bow, that is pointing towards how you are proactive in using that period, that time.
Dustin, you can unmute. You have a question.
Just have, you may have nothing to say about this at all, but looking at Edinburgh as a potential place to look for work after school. I don't know if you, like, can speak to any of the specialties there. Like, what if there are firms that if you want to get into this thing, then Edinburgh specializes in that or not, or maybe stay away from it,
Not really. I know Edinburgh. If you want to go and live in Edinburgh, great. It's one of my favourite cities in the world, so don't shy away from going to live in Edinburgh. All major firms have presence everywhere, so it may be that it's a smaller presence and therefore, like I say desk, but like it may be that it's a smaller desk and less people there, and not your major hub sites, New York, London, Hong Kong, Singapore. But yeah, well, why not? It won't really change what you do, I guess. For my sort of role, the larger the site, generally the larger the risk mandate. So there's that to consider. But no, I'd go and work wherever you want. I don't think there's an issue with that.
Do you think that if, for example, if it's a smaller desk, it's going to be easier to get into, or maybe it's the opposite? I don't know if that even matters.
It could go both ways, right? I think it could definitely go both ways. And also it could go both ways in terms of learning. If you're on a small desk and somebody's super keen to teach you, it'll be a lot of their focus. If you're on a small desk and they don't really care that they want to teach you, then but that's that's by the by, really. You can't guess that before you go into it.
Cool, thanks.
So, Robert, what's your interaction with Canadian banks? Are you dealing with Toronto a lot? Are you seeing
so
Toronto
no, we don't. I mean, we deal with London. We work London hours, so we'll always go via London sales coverage. But we deal with TD, with RBC. We invest in Canadian paper as well. So yeah, we speak to the Canadian guys. RBC have their sales coverage is fairly Canadian.
Okay.
I don't know whether that's a function of they worked in Toronto and then moved to London, and they were trying to build their London guys. I'm not sure what that is. TD are more UK guys working in at a Canadian bank.
Super. So listen, I think we're going to end it off here because it is getting a bit late. Robert, you've been with us for an hour and a half, believe it or not. I want to thank you again. This was terrific. Again, we have recorded this session, so it's going to be available. I want to thank Carmen. Carmen is the backbone here. She's sort of organized everything. And I also want to thank our students for joining us. It is a good start, everyone, for you. Robert is going to be available to join on LinkedIn. He's an excellent resource and a resource that I think I'll be in touch with for quite a while. So we look forward, Robert, to you sort of developing your career, and we'll be in touch again. But this was fantastic. So I want to thank everyone again and say bye. And we'll leave it at that.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Robert.
Take it easy. Have a great day.
Thank you, Carmen.